All right. Get ready to dive into Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I know, Austen can seem a little daunting, but trust me, it's anything but boring. We're talking witty banter, societal pressures that'll make you super glad you live in the 21st century, and of course, enough romance to make your heart skip a beat or two. So we're unpacking excerpts from Pride and Prejudice today. Our mission: to give you the ultimate cheat sheet. Understand this world of balls, fortunes, and impossible romantic expectations. Think of us as your Austen translators. Now, we can't start without mentioning that opening line, right? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Iconic, right? Even if it's a little simplistic. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It sets the stage perfectly for this marriage frenzy that drives the whole plot. But when you really dig in, the novel reveals a much more, shall we say, complex view of relationships and those societal expectations.
Okay, so let's get into it. What about this whole inheritance issue hanging over the Bennet family? The excerpts mention something called entail. What is that exactly? And why is Mrs. Bennet freaking out about marrying off her daughters?
Okay, picture this. It's the late 18th century, and entail is basically the name of the game when it comes to inheritance. Basically, it's this whole legal system that dictates how property gets passed down. And you know what? Women. Totally left out. Estates often had to go to male heirs, even if they were distant relatives. So for the Bennets, with 5 daughters, no sons, this isn't just an issue, it's an emergency.
No wonder Mrs. Bennet's practically shoving her daughters at any eligible bachelor who walks in the door.
Exactly. And it's really interesting how Austen uses Mr. Bennet to show just how normal this whole patriarchal system was, for both men and women. He actually regrets he didn't put aside money for his daughters. He just assumed a son would eventually come along and inherit.
Talk about pressure. Every little interaction, every decision suddenly feels huge for these characters. And speaking of pressure and making a big entrance, Bingley and Darcy. Talk about a study in contrasts.
You're telling me Austen is brilliant at using those introductions to show how crucial first impressions are, something I think we can all relate to, even today. Bingley, all smiles, super charming, wins everyone over instantly. Darcy, on the other hand, well, he's a bit more of a mystery.
Yeah, he's got that whole brooding, mysterious thing going on. And let's not forget those rumors about his massive fortune. It's almost like his wealth makes people even more judgmental, don't you think?
Totally. Austen's really clever about showing how money, or at least the idea of money, can totally warp how we see other people. We make snap judgments all the time. Darcy, despite being wealthy, is seen as proud and kind of standoffish. It's the perfect example of how appearances can be deceiving, a theme we see again and again in the novel.
Makes you wonder if we're ever truly free from making those snap judgments. Okay, but just as we're forming our opinions about Darcy, in walks Mr. Wickham. He's charming, handsome, and apparently the victim of Darcy's supposed cruelty. It's like Austen's giving us two sides of the same coin, isn't it?
It's like a masterclass in deception, honestly. You, the listener, you're practically in Elizabeth's shoes trying to figure out who's genuine and who's putting on an act. This is one of the things Austen does best, showing us how complex people are and how our own biases, our own baggage can really cloud our judgment.
And just when we think we're starting to figure things out, bam! Darcy's letter arrives and exposes Wickham's true colors. What a plot twist.
It makes you question everything, right? It reminds us that sometimes the most charming people, the ones who seem so put together, are the ones hiding the biggest secrets. It's something that's still so relevant today. How often do we get caught up in outward appearances only to find out later that the truth is way more complicated?
It's like Austen is holding up a mirror to society, don't you think? Both back then and now. With all this deception going on, it's no wonder the pressure to make a good match is so intense. But then Austen throws another curveball at us. He gives us two totally different views on marriage society. Charlotte Lucas, who believes in playing it safe, and Elizabeth, the hopeless romantic.
It's such a classic contrast. Charlotte sees marriage as security, a means to an end. She's practical. But Elizabeth, she's all about love and a genuine connection. And the interesting thing is, both perspectives were valid in Austen's time. It reflects the limited options women had back then.
It's kind of heartbreaking to realize that for many women back then, marriage wasn't about love, it was about survival. It makes Elizabeth's journey even more interesting. She dares to want more than that, to believe that love, not just convenience, should be the foundation of a marriage.
And her initial attraction to Wickham, that makes her journey even more relatable. I mean, haven't we all fallen for someone's charm at some point, only to discover, ouch, there's not much beneath the surface?
Oh, tell me about it. But that's what makes Elizabeth so relatable, right? She makes mistakes, misjudges people, but she learns from it. In the end, she figures out that character is way more important than superficial charm, which is a lesson for life, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And that's where it gets really fascinating. Darcy, our brooding hero, he goes through a huge change, like a full 180. He goes from basically not caring at all to actively trying to save the Bennet family from, well, social disaster.
It's like he suddenly learned empathy.
Exactly. And it's really cool how Austen takes that typical romantic hero, and flips the script. Darcy's actions really reveal his true character, don't they? He's driven by this sense of honor, and dare I say, he's finally realizing he's made some mistakes.
Talk about a wake-up call, right? And speaking of wake-up calls, Elizabeth's whole world is about to be turned upside down. She finds out the truth about Darcy and Wickham, and let me tell you, it's a game changer.
It's like everything she thought she knew just disappears. And suddenly, she has to face this possibility that she completely misjudged Darcy. Remember, she's always prided herself on her judgment, on seeing people for who they really are. But even the most perceptive person can be blinded by, well, by pride and prejudice.
That's humbling, for sure. And it makes her question everything, not just about Darcy, but about herself, too.
Right. It's a major turning point for them, but it's also a huge moment of self-discovery for Elizabeth.
It's funny how life has a way of doing that, isn't it? Challenging what we think we know. Okay, but just as Elizabeth is starting to see Darcy in a new light, Austen throws us another curveball. Lydia runs off with Wickham. Talk about a scandal.
It's the ultimate act of rebellion, but it also shows just how naive Lydia is and how manipulative Wickham can be. Remember, back then, a woman's reputation was everything. Lydia's actions, they haven't just put her own future at risk, but her sister's too.
It's a stark reminder of just how restricted women were back then. One wrong move could ruin your life.
Absolutely, and Austen doesn't sugarcoat that at all. She shows us how terrifying it was for families, especially women, in those situations. Mrs. Bennet's losing it. Mr. Bennet has to face his own failings as a father. Even Elizabeth, who's usually so level-headed, even she's overwhelmed.
Total chaos.
Yeah.
And just when it seems like there's no hope, Darcy, being the stand-up guy he is, steps in to fix everything.
This is where Austen's brilliance shines through. The way she develops her characters, it's genius. Darcy risks his own reputation, everything, to protect Elizabeth and her family. And he doesn't do it for praise or recognition. He does it because he's in love with Elizabeth and feels responsible.
It's such a powerful moment in the book. It shows just how much he loves her and how far he'll go to make her happy, even if it means staying hidden in the background.
It's a far cry from that proud, standoffish guy we met at the beginning, don't you think? By doing something so selfless, that's when he starts to break down Elizabeth's prejudices.
Makes you wonder, do we ever really know someone? Or do we just see what we want to see based on our own baggage and experiences?
That's a question that runs through the entire novel, and honestly, it's something we can all ask ourselves, even today.
So true. But even with Wickham out of the picture, at least for now, Darcy and Elizabeth still have some serious obstacles, like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Darcy's aunt. Talk about the queen of snobbery.
Oh, she is a force to be reckoned with. Lady Catherine is like this walking, talking symbol of that rigid social hierarchy that Darcy and Elizabeth are trying to, well, break free from. She's horrified by their relationship, thinks Elizabeth is way beneath Darcy.
Their first meeting is like a clash of the titans. Lady Catherine expects Elizabeth to just back down, to be intimidated by her status. But Elizabeth, being Elizabeth, refuses to be controlled.
Which just shows how strong Elizabeth is. And brave. She stands up to Lady Catherine, not by being aggressive, but with wit and this quiet defiance. She's not afraid of powerful people. That's something I think will resonate with a lot of people listening.
It's so satisfying to read, but we're talking about Lady Catherine. She doesn't give up easily, does she? She decides to take matters into her own hands, which is a whole other story.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, let's just say that Lady Catherine trying to interfere to separate Darcy and Elizabeth, it totally backfires. It actually confirms what Darcy suspected all along, that Elizabeth has feelings for him, and it pushes him to make a pretty grand gesture.
Okay, don't leave me hanging. Does he finally confess his love?
He does. It's romantic and vulnerable all at the same time. He admits his mistakes, tells her everything, how deeply he cares for her.
Okay, but how does Elizabeth react? She rejected him before, right?
This time, it's different. Remember, Elizabeth's gone through her own transformation. She's faced her prejudices, her mistakes, and she can finally see Darcy for who he truly is. Kind, honorable, and totally devoted to her.
It's this beautiful moment of understanding, of forgiveness. They've both come so far, both as individuals and as a couple.
They have, but this is Pride and Prejudice, right? We can't have a perfectly smooth path to happily ever after.
Oh no, what other obstacles could there possibly be? You're killing me.
Well, there's still family drama to deal with. Remember Elizabeth's family? They mean well, but they're kind of known for their social blunders. And don't forget Lydia and Wickham. That marriage, yeah, that's going to cause some tension and problems down the line.
So even though Darcy and Elizabeth are finally on the same page, they still have a lot to figure out. Family, societal expectations, and let's face it, their own past mistakes.
Exactly. But before we jump into that final part of this whole romantic roller coaster, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to talk about the ending of Pride and Prejudice and what Austen's trying to tell us about love, society, and how we can grow and discover ourselves along the way.
Okay, we're back. After all those twists and turns in Pride and Prejudice, I'm honestly impressed anyone found happiness at all.
It's what makes Austen so brilliant, right? Even in romantic comedy, she doesn't shy away from how messy real life can be.
Totally. And speaking of messy, we left off with Darcy and Elizabeth finally admitting their love for each other, but with their families, and that's society. I have a feeling it's not going to be easy.
You're right about that. They might have figured out their own issues, but Darcy and Elizabeth still have to deal with their families and what everyone else thinks.
Well, let's start with Lady Catherine, the queen of what's socially acceptable, right?
Okay.
And she is not happy about this engagement. What does she do when she hears about it?
Let's just say she doesn't send a gift basket. Lady Catherine is horrified, outraged. She can't believe Darcy would even think about marrying someone like Elizabeth. Thinks her family's way below him socially.
It's like she can't wrap her head around someone choosing love over, well, social climbing. But it's awesome how Austen uses Lady Catherine to show just how rebellious Darcy and Elizabeth's relationship actually is.
They're totally shaking things up. Darcy isn't just picking a wife. He's choosing love, happiness, a woman who challenges him in all the best ways. It was a radical message back then, and it still resonates today.
And Elizabeth, being Elizabeth, handles Lady Catherine with grace, wit. She doesn't back down. What about her family, though? How do they take the news?
Mixed reactions, to say the least. Mrs. Bennet, overjoyed, of course, mostly because it means her daughter's future is secure. Mr. Bennet's a little more cautious, worried Elizabeth might be rushing into things.
Mr. Bennet's always been hard to read. But it's interesting. Even when things should be happy, Austen still keeps it real. It reminds us marriage is a big deal, even with love in the picture.
Exactly. And then there's Lydia and Wickham. Sure, their marriage is kind of back on track because of Darcy, but let's be honest, it's not built on the strongest foundation.
It definitely proves that not every love story is a fairy tale. Lydia and Wickham.
Yeah.
That's a cautionary tale about rushing into things.
It all comes back to Austen never losing sight of reality, even in a romance.
So, as we finish up Pride and Prejudice, there's a sense of happiness, but also this bittersweet reality.
Definitely. Darcy and Elizabeth find happiness, but it's not easy. They challenge expectations, face their flaws, and learn what love and forgiveness truly mean.
What a ride. But that's what makes Pride and Prejudice such a classic, right? It stays with you, makes you think about your own life, your relationships, the choices you make because of society's pressures.
Well said. And for you, our listeners, I hope this deep dive gave you a new way to see Austen's work. We talked about love, marriage, the expectations back then, and how important it is to grow and learn about yourself.
Absolutely. So until next time, happy reading, everyone.